Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Klien from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. This is the latest in a series of online video lessons intended to provide you important principles and helpful concepts for the study of communication. In this video, I want to tackle the interrelationship between identity, society, and culture. In a previous video in this series, we looked at the processes of perception and how communication influences the perception process in ways that lead us to learn about and draw conclusions, not just about how other people behave and what might explain who they are based on how they behave, but also ways of understanding our own self-concept from the standpoint of other people. So what we want to do is we want to take it to the next level and think about how our identity is informed in pretty important ways by our social and our cultural positions. Now, when we talk about society and culture, these are terms that feel rather fuzzy, and we often use these terms simultaneously to talk about large groups of people that have some kind of communal identity. But in fact, there are some really important distinctions between society and culture. And these distinctions are going to be important to keep in mind when we subsequently study such things as the challenges and obstacles involved in intercultural and cross-cultural communication, or if we want to try to look at the social and cultural impacts of mass media in popular entertainment. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we've got these first assumptions. So in order to start, let's get fundamental, and let's think about the idea of identity. In a very simple way, identity involves the characteristics and attributes that define who a person is or who a group is. And so when we think about identity from your individual standpoint, you're answering the question, who am I? And when you're answering that question from a group standpoint, you're addressing the question, who are we? And then subsequently, who am I, based in part on the fact that I'm part of this we. Now, in order to understand identity, it's going to be important to note that there are a number of distinct but interrelated dimensions that we need to think about. The first is personal identity, what we can think about as self-concept that's especially connected to our life experiences. This is the kind of identity that we think about when we consider what makes us unique as an individual. And not necessarily that we are completely unalike from anybody else in the world, but when we think about something that is part of me because it's something that I like, or I appreciate, or something that I do, or something that's particularly important to me based on the way that I'm drawn to it. So for instance, I can think of myself as a hockey player. I could think of myself as a gamer. I could think of myself as a crazy cat lady. And before you get too worried about that, some of my best friends are absolutely comfortable in telling the other people in their lives that they are, in fact, a crazy cat lady. So I'm just trying to respect their self-designated identity. But this is the kind of self-concept that describes and understands who we are, because these are aspects of our personally lived experiences that are important to us. However, you're probably already starting to think, well, how does somebody get involved in hockey or gaming in the first place? How does someone even know that the label crazy cat lady is going to be something that other people are going to be able to understand and either empathize with or scratch their heads about? That's where we need to start thinking about identity, not just as personal, but as social. Social identity is derived from involvement in social groups with which we are interpersonally committed. The idea is that we affirmatively enact membership in some kind of group with other people that are involved in common interests and common concerns, and it's our interpersonal interaction, our social involvement with one another in that social group that establishes that identity. So for instance, while I might have a personal interest in chess, I could be a member of the University of Missouri chess team. I could have particular interests in my identity and the history of myself as a black woman, and that might lead me to join the social organization of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. I might be really into Dungeons and Dragons and love the Twitch stream show Critical Role. And so I might end up joining the social construction of those who refer to themselves as critters, who communicate about the show frequently, attend conventions, do cosplay activities, discuss episodes on Reddit, and so forth. What makes all of these social identities similar is that these are groups that we make a decision to join because it's giving us something that we want to have that we are sharing in common with the other people that are in that group. And so it's our social and interpersonal commitment that makes that social identity what it is. Now, that being said, we can now start to see how there's going to be an important distinction between social identity and cultural identity. Cultural identity is based on socially constructed categories that teach us a way of being and include expectations for social behavior or ways of acting. This is something that's much more fundamental. It's not just what kind of people I choose to associate with or what kinds of personal activities I engage in because I want to, but it's getting at something that's much more ingrained and fundamental in our identity that is something that pre-existed us and something that is likely going to outlive us. So for instance, while I might be a hockey player and I might be a member of a hockey team, I can also understand myself as a white man. I might be a gamer, I might be a member of an esports team, and I can understand myself as a woman and as an Asian American. And I might be a member of a sorority from a historically black college or university, but I can also understand myself as a black woman. And these kinds of identities are really fundamental in that due in part to the in-group development of expectations and roles and norms, as well as the interaction of this group with other groups outside of it, imposing power on that group. However it happens over the course of long-standing history and practice. We learn how we are supposed to be and how we are supposed to act based on that. Now, things may be getting a little fuzzy at this point, so let's make sure we lay down some distinctions. First of all, if we're trying to think about the difference between social identity and cultural identity, there are some distinctions that can help us keep these things straight. On the one hand, social identity is externally constructed through membership. You become part of a social group because, generally speaking, you're going to choose to be a part of that group. Membership, however it is that it happens, and there may be a point in time in which you could potentially elect to not be part of that social group, in which case that part of your social identity might go away. On the other hand, cultural identity is internally constructed, and though not all the time, usually it happens even from birth or before birth. When you are born into a particular set of important identifiers. Ways that you are expected to understand yourself, ways you're expected to understand the world, ways that you are expected to try to act based on those things. And it's not something you can choose to have or not have, for the most part. Now, while social identity is driven by interpersonal activity and commitment, you're only really part of a social group if you're actually doing things that enact your membership in that group. Cultural identity is driven by pre-existing historical and social traditions. The nature of that culture was developed long before you were born and is going to continue long after you're not there, right? Social traditions, historical traditions, and other variables we'll talk about in a bit are the things that really make you who you are in terms of cultural identity. And it's not like you can choose to act on those or not act on those. The fact that they are part of your composition means that to some extent people within that culture and people outside of that culture will have these expectations of you. Finally, while social identity is defined by alignment with like-minded others, I can join a chess team or an esports club or a sorority or a fan group. because there are other people who also have those interests and want to interact with others that have the same kinds of interests. Again, this is something that by and large we choose to do, and we can certainly opt out of it at a certain point if we want to. Cultural identity is defined by learned ways of being and acting. This is an education process that happens from the time that we're born throughout our entire lives. We learn what it is to understand ourselves and how we're supposed to act based on that. And while there can be internal differences and even internal differences of opinion between people who live within a particular cultural framework, everyone is going to have an understanding that this is the way things are and this is the way things ideally should be based on our cultural commitments. Now, if you want a really weird way to understand the distinction between society and culture, we can think about a relatively off-the-wall analogy, but stick with me on this one. Think about a mobile phone. Now, many, if not all of you, have mobile phones and you've used them for a long time. So what I want you to do is think about how that mobile phone works and what you use that mobile phone for and why you use it, and what kinds of things that are in the phone make that phone and the use of it meaningful to you. So when you think about the distinction between society and culture, you can use the mobile phone as a touchstone. Society is like the hardware of the phone, the case of the phone itself, the various buttons that activate functions, the internal microchips and other pieces of technology, the wiring and the lights and all of the different things that make the machine operate. When we think about society, we want to think about structure. We want to think about operational systems, how things happen. On the other hand, when you consider culture, think about the software. Think about the apps on the phone. Why do you use this phone? What do you get out of using this phone? The various pieces of software that come with the phone once you buy it, or the ones that over time you're able to accumulate and collect onto the phone, these are the things that make the phone meaningful for you. You act based on what the possibilities are in the software. So society is the structural hardware that enables things to happen in an organized way, and culture is the software. It's the underlying intelligence. It's the beliefs, the values, the actions, the priorities. It's what defines the parameters of what you can do and what you should do, and why you might want to do those things. So to tease out the distinction between society and culture, we can think about some important differences. If we think about society as a community's organizational infrastructure, we're thinking about such things as geographic space, political and legal systems, economy and commerce, public and private institutions. These are the things that organize and structure and enable the kinds of social and interpersonal interactions that make the community of people able to function and able to do the things that they want and need to do. On the other hand, when we're thinking about culture, we're thinking about a community's core beliefs, values, rules, and expectations. What do we need all that infrastructure for in the first place? And what are the underlying assumptions that led us to build that society the way that we built it instead of some other way? So think about such things as religion and philosophy, arts and sciences, behavioral norms, and of course the communication practices and traditions that make all of that stuff possible. So society is the organizational, structural way of setting up a community of human beings to be able to do stuff together. But the culture is what defines that group of people in terms of who they are, why they are, and the ways in which they should act within that social structure. As a final kind of illustration of the distinction, let's think about the United States of America. Now, not everybody who's watching this video is necessarily a citizen of the United States or a member of U.S. culture, but many of you are probably at least passingly familiar with U.S. society and culture, so we can use this as a basis for teasing out some of these distinctions. What's the difference between the United States of America as a society and the United States of America as a culture? When we think about U.S. society, again, remember, we're thinking about the organizational and structural systems and infrastructure, the institutions and the operational things that enable the group of people in the community to function and do things. So, things like local, state, and federal governments, our institutions of courts and law enforcement, public institutions and services. It's not all public and governmental institutions, of course. We also need to be able to get the things that we need on the day-to-day basis. And so the fact that we have a consumer-driven, market-based capitalist economy is an important part of the social infrastructure of the United States. Our education systems, those institutions that determine what we learn and how we learn it from an institutional perspective. Civic organizations that bring people together so that discourse and common activity can take place. And of course, the communication and media services that are made available so that we can go even beyond interpersonal interaction to be able to share information and share meaning with other members of the society that could even be in very far-flung locations within the geographic space of the United States. So that's U.S. society. How do we think about U.S. culture? Well, what we want to do is think about what are the underlying beliefs and values and sources of our expectations and priorities that led us to build the society in this particular way. So, we're going to think about history. Not just the history of the United States and the history of the colonial region of the United States before it became a nation, but we're going to think about the periods of history that provided a lot of the intellectual and cultural roots of how we understand U.S. culture. So, for instance, classical Greece and Rome, as well as, for the most part, European societies. It's not just history, but we're also going to think about religion. And while there are many religions practiced in a society that structures a recognition of the freedom of religious practice, the Judeo-Christian religious tradition is one that from the inception of colonies being established in what we now call the United States, Christian traditions that come from the Judeo-Christian interpretation of the Bible and relevant religious scriptures provide a moral and a spiritual and an ethical sense for much of what we have instantiated into law. We have a social separation between church and state, but Judeo-Christian religion has traditionally provided much of the basis for how we understand why we do the laws and expectations that we do. It's not just religion, though, and indeed religion isn't necessarily the most important part. We also derive much of our cultural assumptions from classic liberal political philosophy and values. The tradition of the European Enlightenment, particularly in places like France and Britain, from which we drew inspirations for such things as small r republican forms of government, concepts such as the importance of individual autonomy, freedom, and equality, and those other kinds of values that now we think almost synonymously with U.S. culture. We think about family as an important cultural element, and the nuclear family is one that's been particularly important for U.S. culture. In this culture, we tend to think about family in terms of individual households, parents and children living under the same roof. We don't necessarily always think about family in terms of larger, extended, organized family groups or clans, as you might, for instance, in other cultures that might live in more communal living arrangements or indeed entire villages or towns. Now, it's not just the stuff that we teach about in the textbooks and we highlight whenever we're feeling patriotic about our nation that defines our cultural identity. There's also the variety of ways inculcated through historical practice that have led to some pretty significant internal flaws in our culture that have been pretty definitive. For instance, the ways in which U.S. culture has developed race, gender, and sexuality as primary means for establishing social power for some people at the expense of other people. This is something that we don't necessarily equate with as the ideal of United States values and principles, but many scholars of U.S. culture remind us that it's really important to look at these kinds of historical actions as well, because it's not just the stuff we celebrate, but also the stuff that has continually caused us problems as a culture that have really shaped and defined how we understand ourselves. An American ideology of exceptionalism has one that's been important ever since the colonial period. You are probably familiar with such phrases as understanding the United States as a city on a hill, a divinely selected, unique, and special nation that has a mission that is unique in the world with regard to our values, especially values such as freedom and equality. You might be familiar with the concept of American manifest destiny in the 19th century, the idea that it was always going to be the goal of the United States to essentially take over the entire North American continent because as a special culture, it was almost our duty and responsibility to establish this exceptional land for ourselves. And of course, with all of these kinds of values and beliefs and priorities, the ones that feel pretty positive as well as the ones that feel pretty controversial, culture involves all of the art and literature and mythology and music and visual iconography, all of the stuff that we learn about from a very young age and gets passed on from generation to generation that teaches us what it is to be part of the U.S. culture, what the core values and priorities are, and indeed, and it's important to note that cultures can and do change. We're not talking about static human communities that are always going to be the way that they are. Culture wasn't established by magic. Culture is established by continuing processes and practices of communication and social interaction. So, over the course of American history, U.S. culture has developed in ways that not only have tried to maintain what we see as the most important and valuable aspects of our beliefs and values and priorities, but also tried to identify those aspects of our cultural history that have caused some really pernicious problems and that actually contradict the kinds of beliefs and values from our culture that we really want to lift up as most important. So the ongoing work of culture is to continually not only maintain a tradition, but also to identify and interrogate those aspects of the historical and cultural tradition that might be problematic for those who live within the cultural community. So in brief, as you recall, while society is about the organizational infrastructure that makes a human community feasible, culture is about the ongoing negotiation of learned and patterned beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors. And this idea is going to be really important as we move forward in our study of communication and really start to understand how these enduring and powerful elements of culture have a really powerful impact, not just on the broad scope of our larger community, but on how we think and feel and act on a daily basis. So as a final point then to think about when we consider what we mean when we're talking about cultures is that we want to make sure that we move past what generally tends to be the easiest and most fundamental way of thinking about a culture that normally we pick up very early in school, or when we talk about things like expanding our cultural awareness or our cultural surroundings, having different kinds of cultural experiences. We often talk about cultures as particular places that involve certain people from that place. So we talk a lot, for instance, about things like French culture or Spanish culture or Nigerian culture or Pakistani culture. But it's not just geographic places that involve culture. What makes those cultures what they are as a culture is this ongoing negotiation and inculcation of the beliefs and values and norms and expectations of the people within that group. So when we talk about cultures, of course, we're going to talk about things like nationality and ethnicity. We're also going to talk about things such as regional cultures. Even within a larger nation, there can be specific locations or specific areas within a larger geographic space that are going to have their own unique traditions and ways of being. We're also going to talk about things like race. Even though the concept of race is fundamentally an artificial social construct that was established in order to give some groups of people power at the expense of other people, Over the course of traditions and interactions over the centuries, race has become a really important way of thinking about cultural ways of being and acting that should not and cannot be overlooked. We're going to talk about religion, of course. And while religion often gets wrapped up in nationality and ethnicity, these are separable concepts. And we don't want to get caught up in the assumption that somebody from a particular religion is also going to occupy the same kind of ethnic or national space necessarily. We're also going to talk about some things that don't necessarily jump right off the top of your head when you think about what makes a culture a culture. Things like gender, sexual orientation, ability and disability, socioeconomic class. These kinds of constructs of human communities also involve traditions and histories of acceptable versus unacceptable assumptions about what to believe, what to value, and how to act. These kinds of patterned beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors sometimes come from the organic development within the cultural community itself, and sometimes it's happened through the imposition of power from other groups of people coming from outside the culture. But however it is it happens, and this kind of ongoing negotiation of learned beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviors is fundamentally important. Not just to the way that we understand how large groups of people hold certain assumptions in common, but also how we think about the decisions we make about who we are, what to believe, and how to act on a day-to-day basis. So, in a nutshell, that's the relationship between identity, society, and culture, at least a starting point for those connections. If you've got any questions about the content in this video or other videos in this series, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.